Anjelica Huston spent most of her life being seen as something she never fully felt, a symbol of grace, power, and effortless glamour. People looked at her and saw the daughter of a Hollywood legend, the muse of one of cinema's greatest stars, a woman who seemed to glide through life untouched by its rougher edges. But behind everything the public admired was a woman shaped by absence, betrayal, and a longing for love that took decades to find. Now at 74, she is telling her story on her own terms, and the truth is far more human, far more painful, and ultimately far more remarkable than the myth ever was. She came into the world on July 8, 1951, born to John Huston, the towering director whose films had already made him a legend, and Enrica Soma, a ballerina of rare beauty and quiet strength. On the surface, it looked like a charmed beginning. In reality, her father was thousands of miles away in Uganda when she was born, deep in the middle of a film shoot. Days passed before word even reached him, and when it did, his response carried no urgency, no rush to return. That distance was not a one-time thing. It became the defining rhythm of her childhood, a lesson learned early and absorbed deeply, that the people you love most are often the ones who leave you waiting. Her mother endured the same. Before Anjelica had even reached her first birthday, John Huston had denied Enrica a role she wanted and taken up with the actress he cast instead. The affairs that followed were many and open, and the emotional damage they left behind was lasting. By 1960, Enrica had gathered her children and moved from Ireland to London, trying to build something stable out of what remained. Life continued in fragments. John pursued his romances across continents, while Enrica, in her own loneliness, fell for a married man, and in 1964 gave birth to another daughter named Allegra. Anjelica adored her half-sister immediately, forming a bond that would prove to be one of the most enduring of her life. Childhood gave way slowly to the edges of ambition. While still a student, Anjelica found herself near the orbit of a film production, searching for a young actress to play Juliet. The door seemed open, but her father closed it before she could walk through. If she was going to act, he made clear it would be under his watch, on his terms. That led her to A Walk with Love and Death in 1969, a film that put her opposite professional actors when she had almost no experience and placed her under the demanding eye of a father who confused emotional distance with discipline. When the film was released, critics showed no mercy. The experience left her bruised and uncertain, drifting through her school years without focus or direction, while her mother grew increasingly consumed by her own quiet unraveling. Then came the night everything broke. A family friend appeared at the door with news that Anjelica could barely absorb. Her mother had died in a car accident in France. She was only 39 years old. There was no preparation for that kind of loss, no softening the blow. Grief pushed Anjelica toward New York, where life moved quickly and the world didn't slow down for mourning. A photo shoot for Harper's Bazaar brought her into the company of photographer Bob Richardson, a man twice her age whose attention felt at first like rescue. He was intense, devoted in the way that feels like love before it reveals itself as something darker. Anjelica, raw with grief and without her mother's steadying presence, stepped toward him without fully understanding what she was walking into. Richardson was brilliant and deeply unstable. He had been institutionalized, struggled with addiction, and carried the ruins of a previous relationship wherever he went. His devotion came wrapped in volatility. What began as passion tipped gradually into control and then into fear. Once, after Anjelica left briefly for a television appearance, she returned to find that he had destroyed every one of her belongings in a rage over unpacked suitcases. The cruelty was sudden and total. The breaking point came on a trip to Mexico, where after she spent a quiet evening with her father, Richardson greeted her return by hurling a bottle at her in a fury. That was the end. She walked away from 3 years of fear and found temporary stillness at a home in Pacific Palisades, spending her days around horses, an open sky, and the kind of silence that allows a person to begin breathing again. She resisted the social calendar until an invitation arrived for a party hosted by a young actor rapidly becoming one of Hollywood's most talked about names. Jack Nicholson was magnetic, confident, and impossible to ignore. She was still carrying damage she hadn't finished processing, but she was drawn in regardless. What followed was a relationship that would define and confuse the next decade and a half of her life. It began with an early crack that should have been a warning. Days after Anjelica left for a work commitment in London, a friend admitted she had slept with Jack almost immediately after Anjelica's departure. He explained it away. She allowed it. But something shifted internally that never quite shifted back. Suspicion became a background noise she learned to live with, confirmed often enough to be real, but endured anyway, because leaving required a kind of certainty she hadn't yet built in herself. She was navigating Hollywood with a famous surname she was determined not to rely on, partnered with a man everyone wanted, and still searching for proof that she could stand on her own. By 1976, the relationship with Jack Nicholson had reached a point where even the most determined optimism couldn't hold it together. While Jack traveled to New York in high spirits with a circle of friends, Anjelica stayed behind in Los Angeles, moving through parties and unresolved emotion. It was at one of those gatherings that she met Ryan O'Neal, restless and charged with a kind of magnetic trouble that she mistook for depth. When Jack returned, she told him plainly that she believed she had fallen for O'Neal and that she was leaving. It was a confession she herself barely understood. What followed with O'Neal was not liberation. It was something she would later describe as living with two people inside one body. Moments of warmth and charm would give way, without warning, to rage. The violence escalated until one night at a party, when he couldn't locate her in the crowd, he struck her. She ran upstairs and locked herself in a bathroom. He followed and continued. With no parent to turn to, with no adult anchor in her life, Anjelica sought guidance from her 13-year-old half-sister Allegra, who offered the only advice that mattered. Leave. She did. During this same period, she had set her sights on a role in The Last Tycoon, only to be dismissed in the audition by director Elia Kazan with a cruelty that was almost clinical. He told her directly that she didn't have the looks the role required and handed her a lesser part as consolation. She accepted it, stepped onto a set that included Jack Nicholson, and watched the lines between her personal and professional life blur into something almost absurd. The audition wound healed slowly. The lesson beneath it took longer, that she would spend years fighting the assumption that her presence in any room was the product of who she knew rather than what she could do. After The Last Tycoon, she stepped away from film entirely for 5 years. It wasn't a dramatic departure. It was exhaustion, disillusionment, and the quiet recognition that she needed to find out who she was when no one famous was standing nearby. When director Bob Rafelson eventually offered her a role in The Postman Always Rings Twice alongside Jack Nicholson and a rising Jessica Lange, she accepted, partly for the opportunity, partly because unfinished emotional business had a way of calling her back. Before the film was complete, a car accident interrupted everything. Without a seatbelt, she was thrown into the windshield and required surgery to repair her face. The pain was significant, but what settled in alongside the physical recovery was something quieter and more clarifying. She had spent too many years waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen, waiting for men and for her father to decide she was worth their full attention. She was approaching her 30s, and the waiting needed to stop. She threw herself into study and small roles, surviving without attaching her progress to anyone else's name. Then came Prizzy's honor, and with it a complication layered enough to almost seem designed to test her. Jack Nicholson would play opposite her. Her father would direct. When she hesitated, her instincts were sound. During salary negotiations, she was told plainly that she had no real talent and was present only because of the famous men around her. In earlier years, those words would have sent her into retreat. Instead, they steadied something in her. She stayed. She worked. And when the film was finished and the Academy Award nominations were announced, Prizzy's honor received 8. Only one became a win. It belonged to Anjelica Huston. When her name was read aloud, The feeling was almost too large to hold. Rather than moving toward the press, she turned and ran back to her father. He was weeping. She threw her arms around him and thanked him not as a director, but as a parent. It was the first time her success felt entirely her own, unshared and undiluted, and she let herself feel the weight of it without immediately softening it or giving it away. In the years that followed, John Huston poured the last of his energy into The Dead, a film he was determined to make as a final gift to his family. Anjelica's brother Tony had written the script. Their father's health was fragile, oxygen tanks never far away, and the crew made accommodation after accommodation to allow filming to continue. Watching him direct, while visibly fading, was one of the hardest things Anjelica had ever witnessed. The experience left her physically exhausted and ill. When the film was finally complete, his condition worsened rapidly. She visited him every day in the hospital, building a routine around the belief that she could hold things together through presence alone. One night she said goodbye and promised to come back the following day. He died before she could. He was 81. Despite the distance that had defined their early years, he had become one of the most consistent presences in her adult life, and losing him left her in a disorientation that took a long time to name. As the decade closed, the relationship with Jack Nicholson that had shaped so much of her life quietly ended for good. She traveled to Cannes as a festival juror, and the world continued turning around her. A brief and charming encounter with Prince Albert of Monaco provided a moment of lightness, but nothing lasting. What actually mattered was quieter. A mutual friend's gentle introduction to a sculptor named Robert Graham, whose steadiness and warmth felt unlike anything she had known before. She moved toward that warmth slowly and carefully, as if she had finally learned that the things most worth having were the ones that didn't require you to brace yourself. With Robert Graham in her life, Anjelica Huston entered a period of quiet happiness that felt almost foreign in its consistency. Love, for once, did not arrive with conditions or volatility or a secondary agenda. And almost in parallel, her career reached a threshold she had been moving toward for years. When producers offered her the role of Morticia Addams, she felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of arrival. She had grown up watching the Addams Family cartoons, privately imagining herself in that role with a specificity she'd never shared aloud. The fantasy had lived in her for decades. Now it was real. The reality of playing Morticia, however, came with physical demands that were relentless and exhausting. The corsets were cinched so tightly she could not sit inside a car. The makeup process required fabric tabs to be glued to her face and taped behind her head to hold her features in the precise aesthetic the character required, leaving her with chronic headaches and skin rashes after every shoot. It was unglamorous, uncomfortable work hidden beneath a highly glamorous surface, a dynamic Anjelica understood better than most. The film became a massive hit and eventually grew into something that transcended its release, embedding itself permanently into the broader culture with her performance at the center of it. Away from set, the relationship with Robert deepened steadily. A visit to Ireland, to the childhood home where so much of her early life had been shaped, provided the setting for a proposal she did not see coming. They married in 1992. For the first time in her life, Anjelica allowed herself to believe that what she had found would last. But even within that happiness, a private grief had begun to surface, one she had never fully faced. Motherhood had not been part of her earlier life by circumstance more than choice. Her relationships had been too unstable, the ground too unsteady beneath her feet. After leaving Jack Nicholson, she finally turned toward the question she had spent years avoiding, only to receive an answer that broke something open inside her. Doctors delivered a diagnosis of endometriosis and told her that becoming a mother was unlikely. The news stirred layers of feeling, anger, grief, a quiet sense of inadequacy she knew intellectually wasn't rational, but felt anyway. She and Robert pursued fertility treatments with patience and genuine hope. The outcome never changed. It was a loss she carried privately, folded into the life she continued to build outwardly, mourned without public acknowledgement and without ever being fully resolved. The 1990s nonetheless became the decade in which Anjelica truly came into her own professionally. Freed from the long shadows of her father's legacy and Jack Nicholson's fame, she worked steadily and with increasing confidence across film and television. She even moved behind the camera as a director, finding that the instincts she had spent years quietly developing were more than sufficient to lead a set. Without consciously pursuing it, she had become the kind of effortless, authoritative presence in Hollywood she had grown up watching from the outside. Her role in the Royal Tenenbaums brought renewed critical admiration, but the production itself carried tensions she hadn't anticipated. Veteran actor Gene Hackman created a hostile atmosphere on set, particularly directed toward the film's young director Wes Anderson. The situation grew uncomfortable enough that Anjelica and Bill Murray took it upon themselves to intervene, with Murray at times appearing on his days off simply to provide a buffer and keep the environment from becoming worse. It might have been the foundation for a genuine friendship. Instead, when the two were reunited on The Life Aquatic, the warmth had evaporated entirely. Murray was cold and dismissive, excluding her from a cast dinner near the start of the shoot in a slight she did not forget. Professional life, even at its heights, had a way of reminding her that goodwill was never guaranteed. There was another silence she carried for years, one connected to a night of professional triumph rather than failure. After winning her Academy Award for Prizzi's Honor, Anjelica became aware, gradually and unmistakably, that Oprah Winfrey, whose deeply celebrated performance in The Color Purple had been among her competition that year, had grown cold toward her. Whether the distance was the direct product of a loss or something more complicated, Anjelica could only interpret what she experienced, which was a sustained and deliberate absence of warmth from someone who might have been a peer. She has spoken about it carefully, aware that perception and intention don't always align, but the silence was real to her, and it lingered. Through all of it, Robert Graham remained her anchor. Their life together had a quality she had never managed to sustain before: genuine peace, mutual respect, the absence of performance. Then in 2007, he became seriously ill. 6 months later, he was gone. The grief that followed was of a different kind than anything she had experienced before, deeper and quieter and without an obvious path through it. She never pursued another romantic relationship. What she had found with Robert felt complete in itself, and she chose to live inside that completeness rather than reach for something new. Healing came through work and through words. She threw herself into projects including the television series Smash, and eventually into writing 2 memoirs that traced the arc of her life with honesty and care. The process of writing forced her to return to places she had long kept at a distance, including the most painful chapter involving her father. John Huston's affairs had been a constant of her childhood, but one crossed a line she struggled to process for years. He had taken up with a teenage friend of hers, Zoe Salas, and announced the birth of a son in a way that left no room for gentleness. That son was Danny Huston, who would eventually become a beloved figure in the family. But acceptance required time, and forgiveness required something more than time. It required a reckoning with what love actually means when it arrives wrapped in betrayal. Anjelica reached that understanding eventually, not quickly, not without cost, but with the kind of hard-earned grace that only comes from living all the way through something rather than around it. That, more than any award or role or famous relationship, is the true story of who Anjelica Huston is.